The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations and lately more and more conversations about climate change, the climate design, and offering solutions with guests who have experience and practices from a variety of angles to give us not only hope, but actual ways that we can help slow down climate decline, if you were. My name is Bahia Yaksan. I'm a core alignment coach, an emotional wisdom training specialist, and a diversity educator. And I've always also been looking at the relationship between the different forms of human oppression and mistreatment of the planet. And we're just rolling more and more into climate issues, although we will balance them out with other conversations about human diversity as well. I wanted to just preface this show before I introduce my guest by mentioning, in case you haven't noticed, we're having all over the world more and more natural disasters. The storms are increasing, floods are increasing, heat waves are hotter, droughts are drier, and snowfalls are greater. There's just a few words I took from the website of the Environmental Defense Fund that a conservative way to look at it as extreme weather gets a boost from climate change. And scientists are detecting a stronger link between the planet's warming and its changing weather patterns. And they further say, though it can be hard to pinpoint whether climate change intensified a particular weather event, the trajectory is clear. And again, because heat waves are hotter, droughts are drier, and strange things are happening. Right now, in my US focus right now in California, I've lost track of how many days we're having continuous rainstorms, strong winds, mudslides, a number of people's lives lost. And it could be during the show, even we lose power because power outages are happening off and on. So I'm extra happy that we have another person today to share some knowledge and information with our listeners and viewers, Heather Nichols. Thank you for being here today. Heather has been the executive director of the Yolo County Resource Conservation District for 9 years. She has a BS in plant and soil science from Cal Poly Humboldt and a master's in sustainable land use planning from the Conway School. She works with land managers and conservation leaders and in the region to develop and carry out locally relevant and effective conservation programs. And I did not know anything about this until pretty recently in my life. And it's like, oh, great. You know, another human being and another agency really paying attention to ways to capture carbon. And I just love that you're here and you can share what you're working with, like ranchers and farmers, about, you know, land use that can be incredibly earth-minded, to use my lay terms. So how would you like to start with, I know there's different programs you have going on, but do you want to give sort of a general picture of what a resource conservation district does?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here, Bahia. I'm really looking forward to seeing where the conversation goes. But I guess just a tiny bit of background, because I know this is a national program, but there are resource conservation districts all over the U.S., and they're kind of county-based, county-sized local government agencies. We often work with the agricultural community on, conservation practices of various kinds. So thinking back to like the Dust Bowl era, the districts came out of that, and then as environmental and ecosystem issues became better understood, and I guess more. The districts started to diversify. We weren't just working on soil health. We were working on water quality, and we're working on the balance of agriculture with continuing wildlife habitat, for example. Those can be in conflict. We're now working on wildfire prevention programming and helping our area reduce the risks of catastrophic wildfire. So those kinds of things. We've diversified a lot over time, and also, and that's happening throughout the United States. But what is interesting is as the climate crisis has evolved, we're turning back to soil as one of the solutions. So there's lots of language. I would try not to get too technical, but land-based climate solutions, for example, it's referring to using the potential for soil as a carbon sink.
In a carbon sink, honestly, can you just define that what that means?
What that means, right? So, basically, when plants produce oxygen, plants grow and they produce oxygen. They're drawing carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil. Their roots and growth and their leaves form carbohydrates and other organic matter, and those carbohydrates exude by roots and mycorrhizal fungus. And there's a lot of organisms living in the soil. They feed on those. They leave carbon as life forms in the soil, and some of that stays in the soil. Some of it cycles back up as plants grow. But there is a cycle there. So it's carbon that's stored in the soil profile via plant growth. And the soil on the planet is the second largest carbon sink next to the ocean.
I did not know that.
So I have a couple, I can just kind of looked up some quick facts globally, because I worked so much on a local level. I kind of had to brush up on a little bit of that. Mm-hmm. But scientists estimate that soils, mostly agricultural ones, could sequester over 1 billion additional tons of carbon each year. And so that looking for that carbon-based or soil-based, rather, carbon sequestration as negative emissions. We think about emissions of greenhouse gases from smoke from wildfires, from the tailpipe of a car, from methane from cows. Those kinds of emissions. This is a negative emission technology, so to speak, one that removes carbon dioxide from the air and stores it where it can't escape easily. Some of it does go back, but there is some evidence that carbon is actually stored over a long period of time. There's the potential for that. So that's the short story. And I'm not a carbon scientist, so.
Well, that's interesting, because I did not understand that a carbon sink stored it. I thought it just evaporated, so to speak. Like the plants was the food for the plants, and it was consumed by the plants. But no, some of it cycles back up. You said,
Mhm.
but a lot of it's stored there. But it causes no harm, or at least it's not emitting. It's not emitting the carbons into the
Yeah, the
atmosphere.
carbon in the soil is in an inert form of C versus CO2. So the other major sink is the ocean, and that's, thinking about deep sea oil drilling. They're trying to access that carbon form that's in the form of oil and gas and bring it up and use it, and combust it for energy. But this kind of carbon is also in it's not in a I'm not this is where I'm like, okay, well, how can I describe that? It's not in the air. It's not a greenhouse gas. It's not in a gaseous form.
Thank you. And one of the programs that I just got a nice snapshot of, because you sent me some information about hedgerows, is very interesting. And I wondered if you could sort of explain the concept of the importance. I think that's just part of your work. I know you worked with land managers and conservationists, and you help farmers and ranchers develop plans for their land with the sort of carbon capture awareness. Can you talk about that some, please?
Yeah, it's pretty new. I'd say it's less than 10 years old. A planning type that's called carbon farming or carbon farm planning. It doesn't mean they're farming for carbon. It means you're looking at, if you're working with a rancher, for example. We have I worked with a rancher here locally in Yolo County who has a several thousand acre ranch. It's on it's grass and oak woodlands, if you can imagine that. It's really similar to like Texas hill country and that kind of things, grasses and a lot of oak trees. And then they have a cattle operation out there. And we worked with them and that family to look at how we could plan for maximizing the potential of carbon storage on the ranch. The ranch is already in an agricultural easement. This family's been kind of a leader in stewardship on rangeland in our part of the country. And some of the things that come, so when you think back to the description of what, how soil is a sink for carbon using vegetation, trees are, sort of the ultimate, one of the ultimate, actually, I would say it's probably the ultimate thing you can do is plant trees. So there's already oak woodlands there and on his property. So where could he plant more? Where could he do some oak restoration or protect oaks from oak seedlings from cattle operations? Maybe we talked about fencing out a pond area that the cattle like to go to and let that go back into oak trees, that kind of thing. So he's really interested in that because oaks are positive for shade for cattle, and they also just have a land stewardship approach. So one of the things we actually had to look at, surprisingly, and this may get too deep into the weeds or the grasses, is prescribed fire. So making sure that we protected the oaks from burning down in a catastrophic wildfire, because then that property would lose some of its carbon sink ability. So that oak trees' roots go down very deep. So there's just a big potential for deep carbon storage, and there's science to back that up. And the other thing that our planners and work that I've done in the past we look for is other incentives, because it's a lot of work to do that kind of thing. So, we work with federal programs and local programs and things to help pay for some of that. But we also look for other benefits. So there's forage production, and noxious weed control that prescribed fire can give. So those are all kinds of things we sort of build up, discuss, does it work in the operation, and we build those into carbon farm plans. So other examples of what can come out of a carbon farm plan is composting on large scales. There is the Marin Carbon Project, is an interesting thing if you really are excited about this to check out. We've done a little bit of trialing in Yolo County too, to see there's some evidence to show if large scale compost applications on places like rangelands will feed the grasslands, increase exudates and carbon sink in the soil over a period of, and actually increase the carbon storage capacity of those of that ground for 20 or 30 years into the future. So it's not like a one-time shot. It's kind of, it jump starts an increased nitrogen cycle into the grasslands. So in terms of farming, and just kind of circling back to the hedgerows that you mentioned, I can talk a little bit about that. But before I leave the ranch, the resource conservation districts are mostly grant funded in California, and Patagonia, the clothing company, funded our time to create the plan for that ranch. So I wanted to give a shout out to Patagonia. There are companies that are trying to incentivize and help cover the costs of some of these things. So climate smart wool and those kinds of things, or climate smart beef, and that, this is what comes out of those. So far we've done compost on their property, and on this ranch in Yolo County, and now we're looking at doing some riparian restoration in a couple spots. So that's basically planting more trees. And then we are also planning some prescribed burn practices there. So we're a big proponent of getting things actually done, which is where I think the hope comes in. Knowing that this is really where we try to get to. So we develop trust and trust relationships with landowners who are managing, finding ways that work for them, help to cover the costs through grants and other programming, to actually get that tree planted. So that's most of my life.
That's great. And I you shared a survey with me of the questions you might, or that you would ask a landowner, right? Or farmers to get their input. And that's got to be a key piece to building the trust. Like, okay, you want to know what I think. You're not here to tell me what to do.
Yeah.
I know that we have some history in this country of agencies coming in and telling people what to do. Right. So it's a very different approach of, and asking them what they want, which would help increase incentive.
That's what we're trying. We know that there's an urgency to get work done. At least from my local organization, we're maximizing the resources that we have. We could probably just use more. Well, I want to say more funding, but there's more interest than there is resources. So working with that tension, it's not, you don't need to force folks when there's a lot of beneficial practices, and that's not across the board, but we do have a lot of things we can do, is what I'm trying to say. As long as we can bring, kind of reduce the barriers and meet goals, other goals that, land managers might have, if that makes any sense.
So the landowners themselves have a sense of urgency, or?
Well, I'm thinking about the climate situation there's a sense of urgency there. So in terms of going about things from a voluntary stewardship perspective, it takes all tactics, but this is one of them that does work, and there is interest, and a lot of farmers and ranchers are willing to get on board. So that's heartening. There's a lot more to do. My understanding from talking about the potential for carbon sequestration in the soil and maximizing what we can do on agricultural lands, it can only work if it's paired with like dramatic emissions reductions, across all sectors of, urban, rural, all of that. So, but it definitely seems like can be a part of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's one thing I really admire about it. It's like finding a piece that your agency can do and doing it. I loved it when you said you like getting things done, regardless, like having influence where you can, regardless of feeling like just seeing the barriers and obstacles and waiting for other people to do it. That's what we need, this kind of leadership.
So the other really there's several. I mean, compost is interesting for farmers. Moving to a farm field, for example. Hedgerows are really interesting too. So hedgerows, I don't know what people think about. I've been in it so long, I can visualize it, but I'm trying to want to describe it a little bit for folks, tuning in. Is if you think of I don't know, the United Kingdom and the hedgerows along the stone walls and that kind of thing. I mean, that's something that's usually planted, and it's refuge for, I think a primary interest in like the UK would be habitat cover for, game animals, and but also field boundaries, and also actually property boundaries and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it was almost 30 years ago, and we're not the only state, and I'm sure, who has tried this, but our county and some other counties throughout the state started working on a conservation practice called hedgerows that is tuned in. I mean, it's adapted to our summer dry, winter wet. They're plants that are native to California and can get established and just live on their own. And they're not crop plants. They're native wild species that farmers are willing to plant for a variety of reasons. One, there's always a farm edge, there's always a farm edge that you can't farm, or a corner, or a super wet corner, or, whatever the reason, right along the creek, you can't farm all the way to the edges. So there's always these weedy edges. And so instead of weeds, which there is published papers on weedy edges versus native edges out of UC Davis and UC Berkeley, there are a lot more beneficial insects and use by pollinators in the native hedgerows than they are in a weedy non-native. We have a lot of non-native weeds in California, just because of our climate so mild. So for farmers, they don't get weeds near the farm edges, and they get some pollination service. So we've been doing this for decades and kind of perfecting that. Our organization puts in several miles of hedgerow every year. And we're doing it primarily for pollination support. That's what, not we are doing it, but farmers are signing up to do for those reasons. And we've worked a lot in research, with researchers and how to maximize pollinator habitat and also provide migratory bird habitat. And a lot of farmers want to see pheasants back and quail and those kinds of things, game birds here. So there's a pretty high adoption rate because they're parts of property you can't use anyways for production, and you get these extra benefits. There are other benefits, soil protection can keep things from eroding, and wind protection, shade for farm workers, those kinds of things. Then we get this data from coming out of Colorado State University with the Carbon Cycle Institute and the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service on some calculations around this carbon sequestration business. And so this came out less than 10 years ago. And we hadn't thought too much about carbon solutions. So we've been doing this practice for 12 other reasons. And now we're finding out it's one of the best things you could be doing, because a lot of it's trees, it's woody vegetation, it's nice big chunky roots permanently growing in the ground, continuing to sequester carbon, and then happily doing all these other things as well. So we do a lot of that. And we're working with the county now to include those kinds of things in our update to our climate. We have a climate action and adaptation plan that our county is doing. So there are emission reductions that agricultural community can undertake, and there are also these negative emission technologies that they also provide via hedgerows, via compost applications, and there's some other things too. Cover cropping is another one. So Bahia, you had asked me to kind of what would be the equivalent, if someone's listening to this, in their own homestead or their backyard or their apartment, their apartment building. What can you do that's like this? If you like to grow things, that kind of thing. And I think it's not dissimilar. Plant a tree if you've got yard space, or volunteer, with a local group to do tree planting. We do a lot of that. If you don't have a space to plant plants, composting. Compost is one of the best things you can do for climate benefits in terms of just household practices. So those are two of the big things: plant a tree or and compost.
And is composting one of the better things we can do in a household? Is there another reason besides the fact that it doesn't take landfill space? Is there
Right. That's it. Yeah. Thank you. Let me lead you there. It's so you instead of throwing your, let's say your dinner scraps, whatever, or your dinner preparation scraps in the trash, and then it goes to the landfill. It won't compost in the, well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it would store in the landfill, but if it's composted, turned into compost, and becomes actively used by vegetation, trees and your garden, I would think it's more readily stored by the soil. Now, someone will probably a scientist would probably correct me.
Well,
but it gets it back into the soil cycle. And I've been to a landfill. I'm not sure how long it would take. Some of those are sealed. and what their contact is with the soil. So I'm getting a little squirrely about that answer, but
it's just helpful to know.
it
Even if we
takes up a lot less landfill space,
yeah,
that's for sure.
yeah. And there may be other reasons, but just reinforcing that it is worth it to compost. I know some people just think, it's the winter. I'm not going to compost for now. Like we can still compost.
That's true. Our office has, of course, we're like total soil and plant geeks at my place, but we have a worm bin that predates me working at the RCD ever. I think it's at least 15 years old. So it's like in a plastic tub, and there's some drain holes, and we put in a few pieces of scraps every day, like an apple or a banana peel. But we've had it for 15 years indoors. And so it's possible indoors too.
Yeah, worms are amazing. I was just thinking about like a lot of yards in dry areas. A lot of people know or have turned to not wanting to grow grass, that it's not the best use of not only water, but land. And I'm thinking about one thing I learned about listening to that talk on hedgerows. I was surprised that you're talking on big pieces of land. You're talking about 5 feet in width. I didn't think it was going to be that wide. But if we have, I'm just thinking out loud, if we have a front yard, it might be that it's small, it's a plot, it's in a dry area. Again, if you're fortunate enough to have access to a piece of land that you can grow things on, and you're not going to grow food, it would be helpful to have, rather than annuals, plant things that have chunky woody roots that'll go deeper and stay for a long time, even if it looks like a hedgerow. That might be better for the soil and the neighborhood, and because it can also capture some moisture.
Yeah, I would say too. So a plant that's a perennial that lives year after year versus an annual would be better. In general, would be better at carbon storage because it lives a few years, and depending on the plant, it could live a lot of years, and you don't disturb the soil. You don't have to till it, which releases some of that carbon into the air. So the soil stays covered, and more carbon stays in. It's one of the farm practices that's really tough in a lot of most crop situations is so low tillage or no tillage setups. It's a challenge, and farmers who do that are very dedicated. But it is a better carbon practice to have the soil covered and to keep your crops in a perennial system. Of course, some of our favorite and some of our most needed food crops are annuals. So other practices are leaving the stubble of rice and working it back into the ground and letting it decompose there versus burning it off or taking it all and taking it off the crops. So you can kind of apply that to your own backyard, keeping your soil in some kind of perennial vegetation versus being paved over. That's another point to bring up. And or bare, those two things. You can also, if you don't want to grow plants, you could cover it with bark mulch or straw, something to kind of keep the soil covered. But that's a big point if you're in a community where, I'm not working with the farming community. I don't have a garden, but I'm seeing that we're talking about farm preservation or open space preservation, and that should be a climate discussion too. The more farms we do lose a lot of farms in California to development, and of course I live in a house, so I'm part of that problem. But having that be part of our discussion when we're talking as a community about building and or maintaining some open space and agriculture, not only for food security and local economies, but climate benefits too. This is in the climate action plan that we had in 2011 for our little county. And I don't know what the source of the information was, but there was a statement that even conventional agriculture emits 100 times less greenhouse gases than like an urban area of the same size. So,
is that because of our pavement is part of the reason for that?
I think it's lack of carbon, the carbon sequestration, because the ground is covered. But I think it's probably mostly related to emissions of urban life, cars per capita, cars per, and the energy that we use and that kind of thing. But
yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to go back to a couple little things, like when you mentioned cover crops, and can you explain that more? Does that decrease the need for deep tilling? Like you could just turn that in without having, and it adds nutrients to the soil. And I don't know, can you explain why cover crops are part of the carbon farming plans?
So yeah, it depends. So there's several different types of cover crops. There's cover crops that keep the soil covered and just add biomass and organic material to the soil. So just like you said, there may be a winter wheat that you grow in between your safflower crop. And I'm just making that up as an example. But and when you go to plant your next safflower crop, you till up the winter wheat, let that decompose a little bit, and then you seed into that. So you've created some organic material on site through seeding with a cover crop. The other kind of cover crop is legume, which legumes they have the ability to capture, they have the ability to produce nitrogen. So they have special nodules on their root systems that can absorb carbon dioxide from the air and can absorb nitrogen from the air. I mean, the air is a lot of nitrogen, right? Actually, and make that plant available. So the nitrogen in the air that I think is most of I would have to double check it, but I think it's most of the gas that we breathe, right? We're 20% oxygen. We're like a lot of nitrogen. It's inert, but plants can't use it unless it's in a nitrate or nitrate form. And that's what this plant can do, is take nitrogen from the air and turn it into nitrate. So it's nitrite and then nitrate until it's available for plants. So that is another reason you don't have to put down a chemical fertilizer. You don't have to bring in manure or compost. You can plant sweet clover or red clover. There's lots of different, it depends on what you're growing, what your soil's like, and so on. And you can include fertilizers there. And that also has a carbon benefit, because nitrogen and carbon have a balance that they do. Nitrogen allows plants to grow more fully and stronger and faster. And that is directly correlated to the amount of carbohydrates and carbon, that plants are able to leave back in the soil if you till that in. Too much.
No, it's good information. It's good information. I was thinking, I want to also ask about prescribed fires. And when that's in a plan, does that mean like there's prescribed time or period of time or cycles of time when you intentionally burn certain plants or areas that either have popped up or that you intend to burn later on? Can you just explain more what prescribed fire is in a real plan?
Yeah. So I guess I'll just start off by saying that Native American people have been doing controlled burning, and that's how they manage land for a very long time.
Mhm.
And we've had to relearn that. And now, so we're the prescribed fire work that we're doing in California is has a long ways to go. So we have a lot of that to do and learn how to do. But we're at a good spot. We're just starting a program in my county for this. That said, prescribed just essentially means it's planned, and it's planned for particular reasons. It's planned to, either reduce fuels that increase risks to catastrophic wildfire. But it could also be, the goal is to reduce a really terrible weed that gets stuck in your cow's nose, that kind of thing. It could do that. It could recharge the soil with some organic matter. But the burning is really small. Like a good prescribed fire is a quiet fire that is kind of boring to watch. And there is some emissions to that, but compared to catastrophic wildfire, it's a lot less. And then the prevention of catastrophic wildfire goes to a long ways to reducing potential future emissions, from something like catastrophic, basically meaning out of control. There are other practices that are probably have a stronger carbon benefit or climate benefit. Prescribed grazing is one of those. So there are other, there's tools, lots of tools that can be used to manage, the land for the best, potentially carbon storage. And it's an iterative process. It kind of depends who's living there, what they are doing, if it's open space, the resources, the weather. So prescribed fire is one of those tools where you would use because nothing else will work. Grazing may not meet your goal. But it's a very handy tool in that you can get a lot done in a short amount of time. So we're learning how to do that. A lot of folks are way ahead of us, but we're starting that process.
So does the Resource Conservation District work with and consult people in charge of cultural fire burning from indigenous communities who have been leading the way forever and asking for cooperation from the state to learn from them?
Yeah, we are we're learning from them. So we have 6 of our staff that have gotten some initial training, and we have we went to a cultural burn just a couple of months ago and got to do some traditional methods of cultural burning. Cultural burning, my understanding is and I don't want to speak on, for the Native community, but my understanding is their goals are typically culturally oriented. So the goal may be, improving forage for elk or deer or basketry or medicines, traditional medicines, and that you're burning for those reasons. So There's a tree called a redbud here. It's kind of a shrubby tree. And if you don't burn that tree on a certain interval, you won't be able to make baskets out of those stems. They need to be a certain diameter and pliability. And in order to do that, one of the best ways, my understanding, is with burning.
And bringing back water too.
Yes.
That's, yeah, incredible knowledge base.
There's a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn.
Well, we have like a few more minutes. Do you have any more practices you want to mention? But I wanted to also make sure you're able to share the website address or contact information for any landowners who might want to contact you.
Yeah. So assuming folks are, out all over the country, contacting your local resource conservation district or your USDA NRCS office and see what they have, how they can work with you. It's really good to have some technical assistance, just to kind of just to bounce ideas off of what might work for your property. And that usually means going out to your farm or ranch, and just mostly listening to what you want to do, what are you interested in, and taking a look at the land that you're managing and offering suggestions and letting you know about particular programs. So, I can give you my email address, or which is heather@yolorcd.org. Our county's name is Yolo, Yolo County. RCD is for Resource Conservation District. Soil Conservation Service, and if you're in certain states, it's called Soil Conservation Service. But it's mostly people helping people help the land, essentially. So that's what our job is.
That's great. People helping people help the land. I love it. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us today and sharing those real practical practices, whether we're a big landowner or have access to a little plot.
Yeah.
It's very encouraging. I think the more that I'm learning from different people about the many different angles and ways to help reduce carbon and slow down climate change, thank you for being a part of the dialogue.
It's my pleasure. And thanks for having me on the show. I'm honored by things you. Thank you.
And thank you to all the viewers and listeners. And I'd like to thank our sound engineer, DJ, and our producer, Dean Piper. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY.com or Talk4 TV. And may we all have enriching conversations and diversity this week. Thank you for listening.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate